The Abbott farm sat on the edge of Boone County like a wound covered by soil, its fences leaning, its windows always dim. Travelers passed it without looking twice, for there was nothing remarkable about the shape of its barn or the slant of its roof. Yet the air carried something heavy, something that seemed to linger even when the wind was high. Neighbors said the land was good for corn and cattle, but it never gave back what it took. No laughter of children drifted from its fields, no Sunday hymns rose from its porch. The place held the kind of silence that makes the body tense without reason, the kind that grips the throat before the mind can understand why. The Abbott family were known by name, though not by heart. Edward Abbott, tall and precise in his manner, kept his hair neatly parted, his boots polished even in mud. His wife Mary carried herself with the look of a woman who had surrendered her voice long ago, her eyes lowered in public, her hands always folded. To the outside world they were plain people, hard-working and disciplined, the kind that belonged to the soil. But something about them failed to settle into memory. Guests who visited recalled the bread Mary baked, the tools Edward sharpened, yet none remembered the sound of children in their yard, though census notes claimed there had once been many. The house itself betrayed little, yet those who came close swore the air was colder near its walls, as if heat refused to settle there. The shutters never opened wide, the curtains never fluttered. Neighbors sometimes wondered why the Abbotts lit candles instead of lanterns, why the farmhouse seemed cloaked in shadow even on bright afternoons. They dismissed it with small excuses, saying perhaps Edward disliked waste, or that Mary had weak eyes. But unease pressed down harder each year, and people stopped visiting unless necessity forced them. The farm became a line on the road one hurried to pass, a place marked by muttered prayers and quickened steps. Whispers grew when children began vanishing from the surrounding area. Some belonged to tenant families who worked nearby fields, others to wanderers who had been seen walking toward the Abbott property but never back. Parents whispered the name Abbott like a curse but never spoke it aloud in church. It was easier to imagine wolves, sickness, or river accidents than to consider the possibility that evil might have roots in their own soil. What terrified them most was not the thought of a stranger's crime, but the idea that something monstrous might wear the face of a man they shook hands with at market. The soil itself seemed complicit. Fields tilled and seeded on Abbott land grew lush, yet the ground near the well always appeared disturbed, as though turned over too often with no sign of crops to explain it. Stray dogs sniffed there and howled until driven off. Rain gathered in odd pools around the house, leaving behind a dark residue as if the land resisted cleansing. In winter, snow melted unevenly, forming strange bare patches in the yard that neighbors tried not to notice. What no one dared admit was that the silence of the farm was not natural. It was engineered. Edward Abbott had cultivated it with the same patience he gave to his crops, pruning voices as carefully as he pruned branches. The neighbors sensed it in the way he spoke, measured, gentle, never rushed. He sounded like a man with nothing to hide, yet every word seemed rehearsed. His politeness became a shield, his stillness a veil. The absence of sound was not emptiness but control, a control so precise that even nature seemed bent beneath it. By 1869, the farm's reputation had hardened into something unspoken. Travelers warned their children not to wander near it. Merchants noticed that Mary bought fabric in muted colors, never bright, never cheerful. She purchased thread but no toys, sugar but no sweets. The ledger of her household was written in quiet, practical lines, as though joy itself had been erased from her lists. Each detail was too ordinary to accuse, yet too consistent to ignore. No one in Boone County asked openly about the missing children. It was easier to erase than to confront, and in that erasure the Abbotts found protection. Yet the silence carried weight, pressing down on every person who drove their wagon past the Abbott property. They felt it in their bones, a heaviness that lingered after they returned home, as though they had brushed against something unclean. The farm became a scar in the landscape, and the community learned to pretend it was not there. But the land remembers what people try to forget. Its soil pressed each secret deeper, holding them close until someone dared to dig. And though the Abbott farm stood quiet, its silence was not empty. It was waiting, and the weight of what it buried would one day force its way back to the surface. Edward Abbott carried himself with the poise of a man who understood how to appear harmless. To his neighbors, he was the model of discipline, a farmer whose fields were always neatly furrowed, whose fences stood straight, whose hands never shook when they signed receipts or offered greetings. He dressed cleanly, his boots polished as though he were walking through town rather than through mud. He spoke with calm restraint, never raising his voice, never hurrying his words. His charm was quiet, the kind that reassured people he was predictable, safe, a man who believed in order. They trusted him not because they liked him, but because he left no reason to doubt him. Beneath that polished exterior was a mind that measured the world as a ledger. Edward did not see children as children, nor his wife as a partner, nor his neighbors as equals. He saw them as entries to be balanced, mistakes to be corrected, names to be crossed out when they disturbed his sense of control. He lived not for joy, but for the comfort of erasure, believing that perfection came when flaws were removed. His farm became the page on which he wrote this philosophy, each crop row a line, each missing child a blank space where disorder had been trimmed away. Edward's rituals began in small acts. He timed his days by the sun, not by instinct but by precise measurement, forcing Mary to ring a handbell whenever a task was complete. He cleaned his tools after every use, not for care but for ritual, scrubbing them until they gleamed, arranging them by size and weight in lines too exact for mere convenience. At first these habits looked like diligence, but the truth was that Edward's entire life was a ceremony of control. Every gesture a rehearsal for the greater silence he was preparing to impose. The community called him a gentleman farmer because he spoke politely at markets, because he nodded to pastors and handed coins to widows. Yet those who looked closer noticed that his politeness never warmed into kindness. His smiles never touched his eyes. He never bent down to speak to children, never allowed his hands to rest casually on another man's shoulder. His courtesy was precise but hollow, the manner of someone acting a part he had rehearsed for years. He was respected because he was useful, and feared because he was unknowable. Inside his mind, Edward carried an obsession with balance. He believed innocence was noise and that silence was purity. To him, the laughter of children was disorder, a clutter that disrupted the harmony of his household. He considered himself a steward of order, a man chosen to strip away weakness. Where others saw children as futures, he saw them as weights pulling his ledger into chaos. And so he crossed them out. Not always with death at once, but with erasures spread over time, like trimming weeds from a garden so carefully that no one noticed the soil was being emptied. Mary knew of his strictness, but even she could not fully see the ledger in his mind. He allowed her small duties, cooking, cleaning, sewing, but he gave her no voice. He fed her words to repeat, gestures to imitate, making her complicit not through choice, but through habit. He bound her in the same order that bound the children, keeping her silence as tight as a sealed page. She never dared speak against him because Edward carried in his very posture the promise of consequence. His politeness was his blade, his smile the warning before a cut. As the years passed, Edward grew more confident in his performance. He knew how to erase suspicion with charm, how to offer the right nod at church, how to help a neighbor mend a gate while concealing the rituals waiting behind his barn. He became a master of invisibility in plain sight. The town remembered his generosity with seed corn during droughts, his punctuality at town meetings, but not the missing names on his census page. His camouflage was built not from shadows but from order so neat that no one dared question it. Edward Abbott was the gentleman farmer, but beneath that title was a man who lived for silence, who fed on the vanishing of names, who believed that erasure was his divine right. And as his mask of charm hardened, the ledger in his mind grew longer, more ruthless, each blank space a victory in the private ritual only he could see. In Boone County, records were everything. The census men rode from farm to farm every decade, their ledgers heavy, their pens sharp, their task simple: to count what existed, to write down each life so that no one was forgotten. Yet when they came to the Abbott farm, something subtle always went missing. Numbers shifted like smoke, names slipped like water from a hand. What should have been many children became fewer, and what should have been joy on paper became silence in ink. The ledger never quite matched the truth. The first year the difference was small. One child missing from the record could be explained by error or travel. But neighbors whispered of seeing Mary heavy with child, then lighter, her arms empty, her eyes red. No grave was dug, no illness spoken of. Yet the next census line skipped past a name that should have been there. A blank space filled the page like a wound disguised as clean parchment. And Edward Abbott, standing tall as the questions were asked, answered with such precision that no suspicion seemed justified. His voice never wavered, his arithmetic never stumbled. He spoke as though the missing child had never existed at all. As years passed, the erasures multiplied. Children came and went in whispers, their faces barely glimpsed in windows before vanishing. Travelers remembered hearing small footsteps inside the farmhouse one season, then none the next. A bonnet drying on the porch rail disappeared with no explanation. No deaths were recorded, no funerals held, no markers carved in wood or stone. It was as if Edward had perfected a method of erasing life without leaving evidence. Each absence swept into silence before anyone dared to notice. The neighbors tried to reconcile what they saw with what they feared. Perhaps the children had been sent to relatives. Perhaps Mary's miscarriages were too painful to speak of. People told themselves these lies because the alternative was unthinkable, that someone they knew, someone they depended on, was quietly removing lives as though they were smudges to be rubbed from the page. The fear lay not in what they knew but in what they could never prove, and so they chose to stay quiet, to look away, to leave the blank spaces undisturbed. But Edward was meticulous. He did not leave silence to chance. He cultivated it. He instructed Mary never to speak the missing names aloud, never to keep mementos, never to hum the lullabies once sung. He removed toys, burned clothes, and scraped initials from wood. He erased not only the bodies but the memory of them, ensuring that even in the hearts of the living there was no trace of the vanished. In his mind, the act was not cruelty but correction. Each missing name a line balanced, each erased child a step toward the perfect order he imagined. What haunted most was not the deaths themselves, but the way they left no shadows. There were no stories, no scars, no evidence to warn the future. The census books became the only witness, holding empty lines where names should have been, but even those lines looked ordinary to any who skimmed them. The horror lay in the invisibility, in the way the Abbotts blended silence into the structure of society itself. If the ledger did not write a life, then the life had never been. Edward understood this too well, and he exploited it with a patience that defied suspicion. By 1869, the gaps in the record were too many to dismiss, yet still no one confronted Edward. Fear of his composure, fear of being wrong, fear of the shame of knowing the truth, all worked in his favor. The Abbott farm became the place where children were seen but never remembered, where each census was less a record of lives than a catalogue of disappearances. And while the rest of the county counted its growth, Edward counted his erasures, proud of the silence he had created, certain that the world would never dare to write against him. On the second floor of the Abbott farmhouse, behind a door that always remained locked when visitors came, lay the nursery. It was not a room of warmth or play, but a chamber of strange symmetry. Rows of small wooden cradles lined the walls, each carved by Edward's own hand, each nearly identical as if born of the same mold. The wood was polished smooth, the edges precise, the craftsmanship deliberate. At first glance, it looked like a craftsman's pride, a father's devotion to his children. But upon closer view, each cradle bore a faint discoloration on the wood, patches that never fully vanished no matter how often Mary scrubbed. These were not marks of love, but stains of something far darker, pressed into the grain as if the wood itself had swallowed memories it could not spit back out. Edward had made the nursery into a laboratory of silence. He approached his infants not as children but as subjects in a ritual of control. To him their cries were disorder, their breathing untamed, their lives interruptions to the perfection he sought. So he experimented. At first he began with stillness, rocking them not to soothe but to measure how long their tiny lungs could hold against the rhythm he imposed. He timed their breaths against the tick of a pocket watch, adjusting the sway of the cradle to force their small bodies into unnatural patterns. Where a father might have sung a lullaby, Edward watched with unblinking focus, listening not for sleep but for silence, counting down until their cries broke into silence too final to be mistaken for rest. The cradles themselves became tools of his ritual. Edward modified them with subtle mechanisms hidden beneath the boards. Sliding panels that restricted airflow, padded restraints that kept small arms pinned. To an outsider, they would look ordinary, the kind of sturdy beds any farmer might craft. But in Edward's hands, they became devices designed not for comfort, but for erasure. He spoke of them as corrections, as refinements of disorder. Each cradle, once filled, was expected to return its burden to him, still and silent, as though the act itself had cleansed his household of flaw. Mary obeyed without resistance. She washed the linens, though her hands trembled when she noticed the stains that soap would not remove. She hung them to dry in the wind, watching the pale fabric twist like ghosts on the line. She never spoke of what she saw in the cradles, but her silence was its own confession. She moved like a servant in a church, tending to objects she knew were sacred to Edward's dark faith. She prepared bottles, warmed blankets, never questioning what end awaited the fragile lives she handed to him. Her complicity was born not only from fear, but from a gradual submission, the way soil eventually surrenders to the plow. The horror of the nursery lay not in sudden violence, but in its slow ritual. Edward never rushed. He treated each act as a ceremony, repeating motions with care as though reenacting a script written by some cruel hand only he could see. The infants were lulled, rocked, hushed, not into sleep, but into permanent stillness. He believed he was refining them, removing their noise, shaping his world closer to the perfection he demanded. And when their silence was complete, he placed them aside, polishing the cradle once more, readying it for the next. Neighbors sometimes wondered why the Abbotts built so many cradles when so few children were ever seen. Edward explained they were practice gifts or spares. No one pressed further, for his voice carried the confidence of a man who expected no doubt. But those who caught a glimpse of the nursery window at night swore the curtains glowed with candlelight long after the rest of the house slept. Some claimed they heard faint creaks of wood rocking against the floorboards, though no child's cry ever followed. The nursery stood as Edward's private altar where life was not nurtured but erased through method and order. Each cradle was both a coffin and a confession, a silent witness to a man who believed innocence was noise and silence was purity. The stains on the wood told the truth no one dared to speak, and the house itself seemed to sag beneath the weight of what was done in that room. The cradles never moved from their places, but the silence they produced seeped through the walls, spreading into every corner of the farm. And as the years passed, the room became less a nursery and more a shrine to absence itself. Behind the wide wooden doors of the Abbott barn, where neighbors believed livestock rested and tools were stored, Edward's real workshop lived. To the casual visitor, it looked like any farm building. Plows leaned against the wall, sacks of feed stacked neatly, the faint smell of hay in the air. But to those who stepped deeper, where shadows pressed thicker and dust-muted sound, the truth emerged. Edward had built a gallery of instruments that no one would recognize for what they were. Each tool seemed innocent, yet each had been shaped with a hidden purpose. The genius of Edward's cruelty was not in sharp blades or obvious chains. It was in disguises. He crafted devices that looked like harnesses for horses but were fitted to hold the small arms of a child. He built racks that seemed to be for drying grain but concealed slots that compressed limbs until bones weakened. His tools carried the camouflage of chores so that even if someone saw them, they would see nothing more than farming ingenuity. To Edward, this was the perfect expression of order, pain hidden inside the ordinary, suffering concealed within daily life. He developed methods of punishment that masqueraded as labor. A wheel used to grind corn was altered so that its crank could be turned only by a child's frail strength, forcing muscles to snap under strain while appearing to neighbors as harmless work. A water pump was adjusted to trap hands in its iron grip, clamping tighter with every push, ensuring that once a child began, the act of drawing water became its own torment. Edward called these corrections, claiming that discipline taught endurance. In truth, he was not teaching at all. He was measuring, testing, refining his ritual of control. Edward's favorite creations were those that blended pain with silence. He stitched small sacks filled with stones and hung them as if they were weights for grain. When tied around a child's neck or back, they forced stillness, crushing breath in slow suffocation disguised as work. He made benches with hidden nails that pricked skin only when sat upon, leaving no marks visible to the eye but carving invisible lessons of obedience. He found ways to use flour dust to choke lungs, calling it clumsiness when a child collapsed, though he had engineered the spill himself. Mary witnessed these devices without naming them. She swept the barn floors, her eyes passing over harnesses and pulleys, telling herself they were farming tools. She wiped away smears of blood and pretended they were rust. Her silence was part of Edward's design. He did not need her to build with him. He only needed her to accept. Her quiet presence made his work invisible to outsiders, for a wife who asked no questions made a husband seem harmless. In this way, Edward not only built instruments of pain, but also forged Mary into one of them, a tool of concealment. What made Edward's cruelty most disturbing was not its violence, but its precision. He never spilled more blood than necessary, never left wounds that could not be explained. His punishments were scientific in their restraint, controlled like experiments. He observed reactions, adjusted variables, noted results. Each child's suffering became a measurement, each cry an unwanted noise he learned to suppress. The barn became a laboratory where humanity itself was tested, where the limits of endurance were pushed under the guise of chores. To the community, Edward's ingenuity was praised. They admired his well-built harnesses, his sturdy equipment, and his ability to repair broken machinery with ease. They said he was a man who wasted nothing, who always found new uses for old tools. They never saw that those uses were for torment, that his true harvest was silence and submission. He was not building a farm but a system, a place where cruelty could live beneath the mask of work, where horror could pass as discipline. At night, when the barn doors closed and the lantern light burned within, the air was filled not with the sounds of cattle but with the muted weight of suffering. Children were bound, tested, broken, then hidden again, their cries muffled by the same tools that tore them apart. And when dawn came, Edward emerged calm, polite, his boots clean, his smile steady. The barn stood behind him like any farmer's barn, its secrets invisible to all but the soil beneath it. Edward Abbott did not see his punishments as cruelty. To him they were rituals, measured and precise, a series of acts that turned suffering into ceremony. He believed the body was clay, that pain was a sculptor's hand, and that silence was the only true form of obedience. Each punishment was not spontaneous anger but a repetition, performed the same way every time as if he were reciting scripture. His order demanded not only control of the household but also submission of the flesh itself. He never used chains, for chains would admit that captivity existed. Instead, Edward bound children with their own belongings, transforming their toys into shackles. Wooden hoops that once rolled in the yard became frames in which arms were forced, twisting shoulders until tendons strained. Rag dolls were tied across mouths, their stitched smiles pressed against lips to quiet screams. A skipping rope was coiled around wrists and ankles, pulled tight until skin swelled, turning play into imprisonment. He took what should have been innocent and made it into the tool of its opposite, as though joy itself was meant to betray them. The blankets Mary sewed carried the deepest betrayal. She spent long evenings by the fire stitching them, believing she was offering warmth. But Edward twisted them into mufflers of sound. When children cried out, he pressed the quilts across their faces, the thread of their mother's hands smothering their voices into nothing. He insisted the cloth taught them stillness, that silence was comfort, that breath was wasted on noise. In Edward's mind, every muffled scream was not cruelty but correction, each gasp a hymn in his private religion of control. His rituals always followed patterns. He repeated gestures as though bound to invisible rules. He would begin by washing his hands as if cleansing himself of the world outside. He lit a candle, placing it in the same corner each time, casting light across the floor in a perfect square. He arranged the objects of restraint in neat lines, touching each one before beginning, as if acknowledging their role. Then he turned to the child, not with rage but with calm, his voice steady, his movements deliberate. It was not violence in his eyes but ceremony, the reenactment of something greater than himself. To the children, the horror was not only in the pain but in the rhythm. They learned to dread the sequence. The sound of water poured in the basin, the scrape of wood across the floor, the creak of the candle holder as it was set down. These were the bells that told their suffering, warnings that came with no chance of escape. Their bodies trembled not only from what was done to them, but from the knowledge that it would come again. Repeated, measured, perfected. Edward believed the body could be trained into purity. He forced children to kneel on kernels of corn until blood seeped through their skin, claiming the body would learn humility through the sting. He bound their arms across their chests with ribbons meant for holidays, saying beauty could mask disorder. He fed them spoonfuls of ash, disguised as medicine, to burn their tongues into silence. Each act was justified in his ledger as a correction, each injury recorded in his mind as a step toward perfection. Mary did not intervene. She folded the blankets after they were used, scrubbed the stains from the toys, and returned the ribbons to their box. She told herself these objects were still what they had been before. But her hands betrayed her, trembling as she touched them, knowing they were now relics of something unholy. She prayed silently, yet even her prayers bent toward Edward's rituals, as if she believed God himself might favor order over mercy. By turning games into cages and comfort into instruments of silence, Edward ensured that nothing in his house remained innocent. Every object carried weight, every belonging was a threat. The children lived in a world where play became pain, where blankets smothered instead of warmed, where their own laughter betrayed them. The farm became a shrine to twisted logic, a place where ritual devoured joy and where the body was no longer a vessel of life but a canvas for Edward's endless corrections. Mary Abbott's hands were always busy. They kneaded dough before dawn, mended clothes by lantern light, scrubbed stains from linens that never seemed to fade. Her movements were practiced, steady, almost graceful, but they carried a weight that could not be hidden. Every gesture was a form of silence, an obedience shaped not only by fear but by years of surrender. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her words were soft and empty, repeating only what Edward would approve. To those outside the farm, she looked like a dutiful wife, a woman who knew her place, a figure of piety. Yet beneath that stillness was complicity, a quiet hand in sustaining the order Edward demanded. Mary had once prayed kneeling in the small corner of the bedroom where the floor creaked beneath her knees. But over time, her prayers shifted. She no longer pleaded to God for deliverance. Instead, she whispered for Edward's approval, measuring her worth in the absence of his anger. She folded her faith into his rituals, believing that to keep him calm was its own form of devotion. Each loaf she baked, each garment she stitched became an offering not to heaven but to the man who dictated her silence. When children vanished from the house, Mary never asked where they had gone. She washed the cradles, smoothed the bedding, and carried on as though nothing had changed. She told herself it was not her place to question, that a wife's duty was to keep her home in order. Yet her hands betrayed her, trembling as she laundered blankets that smelled of fear, quivering as she sewed ribbons that would later be tied around small wrists. She did not stop Edward, but neither did she resist him. In her silence, she became the echo of his cruelty, repeating it in gestures that maintained the mask of normal life. The neighbors saw her in town sometimes, her eyes lowered, her face pale. They said she was meek, submissive, a woman ruled by her husband's will. They pitied her, but none suspected how deeply her silence fed the darkness inside the Abbott home. For while Edward designed the rituals, it was Mary who cleaned their aftermath, who erased the visible traces so the farm could appear ordinary. Without her quiet labor, the facade would have cracked, suspicion might have grown. In her stillness, she shielded him, whether she meant to or not. Her complicity was not loud or dramatic. It was woven into small daily acts. She packed baskets with food when Edward demanded solitude in the barn, ensuring no neighbor would disturb him. She hummed softly in the kitchen to mask faint noises from upstairs. She looked away when children whimpered at the table, placing her hands firmly in her lap as if to remind herself not to reach out. She learned that compassion was dangerous, that kindness might draw Edward's disapproval, and so she smothered both within herself until nothing was left but obedience. The tragedy of Mary was not only that she allowed cruelty, but that she reshaped herself into its servant. She convinced herself her silence protected her, that by yielding she avoided greater harm. Yet in truth, her submission deepened the cycle, making her both witness and accomplice. Each stitch in her sewing needle tied her closer to Edward's rituals. Each loaf of bread fed the man who fed on silence. and in her heart she knew she could never wash the stains from her hands, no matter how many times she scrubbed them raw. Mary Abbott lived as a ghost in her own home, her life reduced to service, her faith redirected into fear. Her hands were never idle, yet their work did not build but conceal. She became the keeper of Edward's order not by design but by surrender, until even her prayers no longer belonged to God. In her quiet, Edward found his perfect accomplice, and in her silence the horror of the Abbott farm endured, unseen by all who looked from the outside. At the farthest edge of the Abbott property, beyond the fields and the sagging fences, stood a well. To the passing eye it was no different from any other, a simple wooden frame with a rope and bucket, its stone mouth covered with a weathered lid. Neighbors assumed it had dried long ago, for the Abbotts never drew water from it, choosing instead the pump closer to the house. Yet the old well remained, guarded not by use but by absence, avoided by all who crossed the property. Even animals kept away from it, as though they sensed what lay beneath. Edward Abbott called it the cleansing pit. To him it was not a source of water but a vessel of erasure. He saw it as the final step in his ritual of control, the place where the evidence of life could be stripped of meaning and cast into silence. It was not enough for him to quiet children, not enough to bind or smother them. He needed to purge their existence from memory, to drop their traces into a void where no one would think to search. The well became his altar of disposal, the ground that received not bodies in full but fragments that carried identity. Inside the pit lay remnants that no one in Boone County could imagine. Teeth, carefully pried loose from small mouths, glistened in the dark like pale seeds. Buttons torn from garments floated on stagnant water, bobbing like tiny eyes that had once fastened coats against the cold. Strands of hair, bound together in knots, clung to the stone walls, preserved by dampness, turning the well into a tapestry of erased children. Each item was not discarded carelessly, but placed with intention, part of Edward's ceremony of cleansing. He believed that by breaking bodies into parts and scattering them into the pit, he was severing them from the world above, cutting the thread that tied them to memory. Mary knew of the well. She carried bundles there when Edward instructed, her hands trembling as she lowered the rope. She did not ask what she dropped into the pit, though sometimes the weight betrayed her, too heavy to be only cloth. She turned her face away from the smell that rose upward, damp and sour, tinged with the unmistakable rot of something once living. She told herself the well was cursed ground, and that her role was not to question but to assist. Each time she walked back to the house, she prayed silently that the earth would never return what had been given to it. Edward's genius lay in the banality of the well. Neighbors saw only an unused structure and thought nothing of it. Children from nearby farms whispered of ghosts there, but no one dared to look inside. Its very existence was explained by the past, by the idea of a once thirsty farm now abandoned of need. Edward relied on that invisibility, knowing that his pit of erasure would never be examined, that his offerings would sink deeper into mud and shadow until they became part of the land itself. For Edward, the act of disposal was more than practicality. It was a ritual. He timed his visits to the well with precision, always after dark, always after his hands were washed. He would lower the bucket, place the remnants inside, and let the rope slide slowly through his fingers, savoring the sound of the drop, the faint splash or dull thud echoing below. To him that sound was not horror but peace, the final silence that completed his work. He often lingered at the rim afterward, gazing into the blackness as though the pit were a mirror, reflecting not water but the emptiness he longed to spread. The well was not merely a hiding place, it was the core of Edward's philosophy. To erase a life was not enough. It had to be unremembered, purged of every trace. The pit became the graveyard of identities, swallowing pieces of children so that the ledger of his household remained balanced, so that no one could challenge his vision of order. And as the years passed, the well grew heavy with its burden, a weight that pressed down on the soil, poisoning not only the ground but the air above it. Those who passed nearby swore the wind stilled, their throats tightening, their steps quickening until the farm was behind them. The well behind the house stood as the true heart of the Abbott farm. It was where laughter was finally extinguished, where objects once filled with life were drowned in silence. Edward had created not only a place of disposal but a monument to absence, a hole in the earth where history itself was devoured. And though no one dared lift the lid, the land around it whispered of what it contained, as if the earth itself strained under the weight of secrets too foul to keep forever. The Abbott farm was not only a place of erasure for Edward's own blood, but a trap for strangers. It sat along a road traveled by boarders, farm hands, and children moving between towns, and Edward understood the advantage of anonymity. His neighbors knew his name, but wanderers had no ties, no records, no one to question when they failed to arrive at their destination. To Edward, their absence was not a crime, but an opportunity, a chance to refine his methods without risk of suspicion. He believed anonymity gave him divine right, that the forgotten could be claimed by his order without consequence. It began with boarders. Young men looking for harvest work knocked at his door, lured by the promise of wages and food. Mary prepared meals for them, setting plates at the long table, her hands shaking as she avoided their eyes. Edward welcomed them with a courtesy so practiced it felt rehearsed, offering beds in the loft above the barn. But those who entered his home never saw another dawn beyond its fields. Their laughter, their songs, their tired voices vanished into the soil, their few belongings burned or buried. Edward tested new instruments on them, recording in silence how long a grown man could endure what a child could not, measuring the breaking point of muscle and bone. Traveling children was still easier. They drifted between families, sometimes orphans, sometimes runaways, sometimes just strays sent to deliver goods across miles. Edward intercepted them with polite words, offering water, bread, or shelter from the weather. They followed him because he carried himself like safety, his smile free of sharpness, his voice smooth. Once inside, they became experiments in obedience, their names stripped before they could even whisper them twice. To Edward, these children had no ledger beyond what he wrote for them, no record to defy his correction. Their vanishing was as clean as ink drying on paper, unnoticed by anyone but the land that swallowed them. Farmhands posed a greater risk, but Edward welcomed them too. Their strength allowed him to test devices at a scale his children could not survive. Harnesses meant for animals were fastened onto men, forcing them into postures that tore ligaments. Grain mills were adjusted so that hands could be caught and ground, the cries dismissed as accidents when no one came to see. Each stranger became a variable in Edward's secret science, their suffering fuel for the perfection of his rituals. He believed he was discovering laws of silence, laws that governed the breaking of flesh the way the seasons governed crops. Mary participated in these vanishings by omission. She washed the dishes after boarders ate their last meal, folded their bedding as if expecting their return, then carried their shirts and coats to the fire at Edward's command. She spoke to no one of their coming or going. The neighbors wondered why the Abbotts always had spare tools and clothes, but Edward explained them away as trades, gifts, or clever reuse. No one pressed, for his explanations were calm, precise, and laced with a confidence that discouraged doubt. Over time, the farm itself became a vortex, a place where names disappeared without echo. Travelers learned to avoid it when they could, muttering of misfortune that followed those who stayed too long. Yet some still wandered in, drawn by hunger, poverty, or trust in Edward's manners. Each was swallowed, their memory erased as cleanly as the Abbott children's had been. The house absorbed their absence, its walls heavy with silence, its rooms marked not by photographs or keepsakes but by the invisible weight of those who had passed through and never returned. To Edward, the act of claiming strangers proved the strength of his power. To erase one's own children was dangerous but explainable. To erase outsiders without consequence confirmed his belief that he was beyond judgment. Each vanished traveler deepened his conviction that he had been chosen, not cursed, that his rituals were not madness but order itself. He saw the farm as a kingdom of silence, and himself as its sovereign, where names meant nothing and memory bent to his will. And while Boone County grew, the Abbott land shrank into shadow, a place where maps ended, where footsteps ceased, where the world itself seemed to stop recording. In 1870, the census man rode into Boone County with his ledger bound in leather and his pen sharpened to a fine point. He was not a neighbor nor a friend, but an outsider tasked with the cold duty of numbers. His work was not swayed by fear of Edward Abbott or softened by pity for Mary. He came to count, and in his counting he noticed what others had long ignored. Each farm gave him names and ages, tallies of children, records of the living and the dead. But at the Abbott farm, the numbers shifted like smoke, appearing one year, gone the next. Without burial, without record, without trace. Edward greeted him with the same polished courtesy he used on all visitors. His boots gleamed, his voice calm, his posture flawless. He answered every question with confidence, reciting the names of those he allowed to be remembered, trimming others with silence. Yet the census man's eyes lingered on the gaps. He scratched small notes in the margins of his ledger, symbols and words that no one but he would ever read. He wrote of inconsistencies, of children seen by neighbors but never recorded, of ages that did not align. They were not accusations, only suspicions etched in ink. But to Edward they were a challenge, an intrusion into the perfection of his ledger. Edward prided himself on erasure. His genius lay in silence, in convincing the world to forget before it dared to question. But the census man's pen did not forget. It captured absence as surely as it captured presence, preserving what Edward had worked years to dissolve. For the first time, Edward faced a record that did not obey him, a document where silence appeared as loudly as sound. His rituals had no defense against ink, no method to smother what had already been written. The realization ignited something dangerous in him. That night, Edward paced the barn, his tools gleaming under lantern light. He touched each device with the care of a priest preparing for the ceremony. The thought of the census man's notes gnawed at him, more unbearable than the cries of children or the whispers of neighbors. Here was a man who could not be silenced with ritual alone, whose ledger carried weight beyond Boone County. Edward felt the stirrings of paranoia, a creeping sense that his order might crumble if even one stranger refused to forget. He imagined officials in distant towns reading those margin notes, following the ink back to his door. For the first time, the mask of the gentleman farmer felt thin. His cruelty darkened under this fear. He no longer lingered in ritual as he once did, savoring each act. Now he rushed, tightening ropes too quickly, pressing blankets harder, forcing silence faster. The precision of his corrections gave way to violence edged with panic. The children, the strangers, even Mary felt the shift. His ceremonies became harsher, his tools more unforgiving, as if he could drown the census man's ink with greater silence, burying suspicion beneath louder erasures. But paranoia has no end. and Edward discovered that no act of cruelty could erase what had already been written. The census man never accused him, never returned with sheriffs or neighbors. He simply moved on, his ledger growing heavy with numbers from other farms. But the marks he left behind in Abbott's entry, the faint scratches of doubt, had already taken root in Edward's mind. They became ghosts he could not banish, voices whispering that his control was not complete, that his silence was not perfect. And so Edward's methods twisted further, fueled not by calm devotion to order, but by the frantic need to prove that no pen, no man, no record could stand against him. The Abbott farm had always been a place where names vanished, but now it became something worse, a battlefield between silence and ink, between a man who believed he could erase the world and the small, stubborn marks that refused to disappear. The night of the fire began like any other on the Abbott farm. The air was still, the fields hushed, and the house cloaked in its usual oppressive quiet. But before dawn, neighbors stirred to the sight of smoke curling into the sky, thick and heavy, rising from the barn at the far end of Edward's land. At first they thought it was a simple accident, a lantern tipped, a pile of hay catching flame. Fires happened often enough on farms, but something in the smell that drifted across the fields unsettled them. Beneath the sharp tang of burning timber and straw was another odor, darker, unmistakable, the stench of flesh cooking where no livestock had been slaughtered. The barn doors had been locked from the outside. Those who rushed forward to help found them sealed tight, barred with heavy beams. The flames licked at the roof, smoke choking the air, yet Edward stood apart from the commotion, his face calm, his posture unshaken. He told the neighbors the barn had caught fire in the night, that there was nothing to be done, that the loss was only wood and tools. But as the roof collapsed inward, sparks spitting into the dark, the smell thickened into something so revolting that men stepped back, their stomachs turning, their eyes watering. It was not hay alone that burned within those walls. Inside, Edward had perfected his final method. He had grown weary of the weight of bones, of the risks of discovery that came with burial or concealment. The census man's scratches in the margins had infected his thoughts, whispering of exposure, of evidence that could outlive him. And so Edward devised a new ritual, one that ensured silence could never be disturbed, one that left nothing behind to be counted. Fire became his instrument as his answer. Within the locked barn, he arranged his victims not haphazardly but with precision, laying them among wood and kindling, fastening them in place as though they were offerings on an altar. The fire was not an accident, it was a ceremony. He had planned it carefully. Oil soaked into straw ensured the flames would spread quickly. Tools lined against the wall were coated in pitch so that their burning masked other smells. He had prepared vents in the barn's siding to draw the fire upward so that by the time neighbors saw smoke it was too late for intervention. Every detail was crafted to disguise horror as disaster, to make what he called purification appear like misfortune. To Edward it was not destruction but completion, the final cleansing that transformed flesh into silence no pen could record. Neighbors stood helpless as the barn collapsed, the roof caving with a roar, sparks shooting into the night sky. They whispered among themselves but dared not voice their suspicions. Edward's calm unsettled them most. He did not rush to save tools or animals. He did not curse or weep. He simply watched, his eyes reflecting the glow, his face unreadable, as though he were not losing but gaining something in those flames. Mary stood behind him, her hands clasped, her body trembling, but her lips pressed shut. She would not speak of what she had seen carried into the barn before the doors were sealed. She would not confess the weight of blankets or the muffled cries that had filled the night before the smoke. When the fire burned itself out, the barn was reduced to blackened beams and heaps of ash. No bones were recovered, no recognizable remains. The neighbors muttered of tools destroyed, of feed lost, but none spoke aloud the truth their noses had told them. The fire had devoured more than timber. It had swallowed evidence, consumed identities, erased lives in a final blaze of silence. Edward explained it as tragedy, a stroke of misfortune. The neighbors, uneasy and unwilling to confront what lingered in their thoughts, accepted his words. For Edward Abbott, the fire was a triumph. In ash he found purity, in destruction he found freedom. No child's name could be counted if no trace of the child remained. No ledger could betray him if bones themselves were gone. He had turned his farm into a furnace of forgetting, a place where memory itself was burned away. And as the smoke faded into the sky, Boone County turned its face once more, leaving silence intact, leaving Edward's final ritual unchallenged. Justice never reached the Abbott farm. Edward Abbott died suddenly, not by the hand of law but by the frailty of his own body. Some said it was his heart, struck down in the middle of the night as he sat alone at his table. Others whispered poison, though no evidence was found. What mattered was not how he died, but what his death denied. The county had begun to circle him, suspicions growing too sharp to ignore after the fire, whispers rising in the town square. But Edward left before they could bind him, slipping into the grave without ever standing before a jury. The silence he had perfected in life followed him into death, sealing his legacy without confession. The sheriff arrived too late. By then, Edward's body was already prepared, his face composed, his hands folded as though he were a man of peace. No autopsy was ordered. Boone County, unwilling to confront the shadow it had long avoided, buried him quickly, marking his grave with nothing more than a wooden cross. His crimes were never spoken of in the courthouse, never etched into public record. The ledger that should have condemned him closed with blank lines, leaving his deeds to live only in rumor. Mary vanished soon after. She did not stay to defend his name nor to confess her silence. Some claimed she left under cover of darkness, boarding a train westward. Others believed she was taken in by distant kin, her identity buried under another name. Wherever she went, she carried with her the weight of complicity, the memory of quiet hands that had fed his rituals. She left behind no grave, no testimony, no final word. Her disappearance was not questioned, for Boone County wanted her gone as much as she wanted to leave. The land itself seemed eager to erase her. The farm remained, standing as a monument no one wished to visit. The house sagged into itself. The barn lay in ruins, and the well-gathered rainwater in rot. Children of the county were warned to keep away, told stories of curses and ghosts to frighten them off. Adults avoided it too, though for different reasons. They feared what might be uncovered if anyone dared to dig. Better to let the soil hold its secrets, better to let silence reign, than to risk seeing what had been done there. The Abbott farm became a scar the community chose to forget, a haunted corner of land left to decay. No graves were marked for the children who had vanished. No bones were recovered to honor, no ceremonies held to grieve. Their names remained missing from ledgers, their lives absent from history. Families who suspected the truth carried their pain quietly, unwilling to accuse without proof. To speak aloud was to risk shame, to risk the weight of admitting they had allowed Edward Abbott to live among them unchecked. So the county let it rest, smothering its guilt in silence, carrying on as though the children had never been. What endured were rumors. They passed from mouth to ear like a sickness, changing shape with each telling but never losing their weight. Some said the well still held hair and teeth. Others swore the smoke from the barn had carried voices into the sky. A few claimed Edward's ghost walked the fields, counting names on a ledger no one could see. But none of these whispers became recorded, none were entered into court. The trial that should have spoken the truth never came, and so the horror of the Abbott farm remained buried in gossip, preserved in silence, protected by fear. Edward Abbott's death was no victory. It was an escape, leaving his rituals unpunished, his victims unnamed, his farm untouched by law. The county's relief at his absence was its own betrayal. For in choosing quiet, they became accomplices once more. And so the story of the Abbotts slipped from history, not because it was resolved, but because it was left unfinished, a wound that healed over without ever being cleaned. Years after Edward Abbott's death, the traces of his cruelty remain not in graves or monuments, but in the absence that lingered in records. The census books still bore the gaps, silent lines where the names of children should have been written. Those blank spaces became ghostly markers, haunting the pages more than inked deaths ever could. The numbers shifted strangely from year to year, as if the Abbott household had been built on vanishing, each decade quietly reducing what had once been claimed. Scholars who reviewed the ledgers decades later stumbled on the inconsistencies, but by then the evidence had rotted away with the barn, the well, and the whispers of those too afraid to speak aloud. The legacy of the Abbotts was not one of confession, but of erasure. Local law began to change. Boone County, unsettled by the rumors that clung to the Abbott farm, grew wary of the silences that once passed as normal. Census takers were ordered to return for follow-ups, to confirm not only the number of children but their faces, their voices, their very presence in a home. Households were no longer trusted by words alone. Officials demanded proof. Behind this policy was the memory of the Abbotts, though no one named it openly. The law itself became a scar, an attempt to prevent another farm of silence from growing unchecked. Yet even in reform, the Abbott's shadow guided the hand of authority. Whispers hardened into cautionary tales. Parents warned their children not to stray near abandoned wells, not to accept food from strangers too politely, and not to trust farms where laughter was absent. The Abbott name was rarely spoken directly, but its meaning bled into folklore. Stories told of barns that burned with children inside, of wives who prayed to men instead of God, of land that swallowed bones. These tales carried on in hushed tones, growing darker with each retelling, serving as warnings for generations. Yet the truth behind them remained blurred, the real suffering lost in rumor, the actual victims unnamed. In this way, Edward Abbott succeeded in his final erasure. His horrors survived only as shadows, never as facts. What made the legacy most haunting was not the cruelty itself, but the silence that allowed it to live. The neighbors who suspected but said nothing, the families who noticed missing names but dared not confront, the officials who closed ledgers without questions, all had played their part. Edward had built his rituals on their unwillingness to see, and when he died, that silence did not die with him. It seeped into the soil of Boone County, into the caution of its people, into the way the community chose for getting over memory. The crime was not only his, but theirs, preserved in every blank line of the census. Even the land carried the weight. Farmers who later tilled near the abandoned property spoke of soil that turned blacker than the rest, of strange patches where no crops grew. They found fragments, buttons, scraps of cloth, the occasional tooth, that they hurried to bury again, afraid of what they suggested. No one dared to claim those remnants, no one dared to mark them as graves. The ground itself had become complicit, swallowing history just as Edward had taught it to. It stood as a monument not to memory but to forgetting, a place where erasure was sacred. The Abbott story became less about one man and more about what communities fear most, the possibility that horror can live beside them, hidden by manners and rituals, unnoticed because no one dares to acknowledge what they sense. The true terror was not in Edward's devices nor in the cradles or the well, but in the quiet nods of neighbors who looked away. In the county's relief when he died before judgment could come, in the ease with which memory agreed to vanish. His evil thrived not in chaos, but in the silence of those who surrounded him, in the comfort they found in pretending nothing was wrong. And so, the Abbott farm faded from sight, but its absence grew louder with time. Historians, decades later, would puzzle over the missing names, the censuses that read like half-finished sentences. Families whispered stories but never wrote them down. Children grew up with warnings but no facts. The legacy of Edward Abbott was not one of bloody spectacle or infamous trial. It was the emptiness he left behind, the hollow space where records, graves, and voices should have been. He taught a county how easy it was to bury truth without ever lifting a spade. This was the inheritance of Boone County. Not memory, but silence. Not justice, but the quiet lesson that evil does not need to shout to endure. It only needs a community willing to turn its face away, a ledger willing to skip a line, and a farm willing to keep its doors closed. In that silence, Edward Abbott's order lived on long after his body decayed, proving that sometimes the most enduring legacy is not what is remembered but what is erased.